episode of the Lead the Machine podcast, where today's leaders and tomorrow's talk about the human side of AI at work. I'm your host, Kirsten Marr, and so pleased to have a very special guest on Lead the Machine today, my dad, Clay Marr. You are in for a real treat as Clay will share his experience being at the formation of Silicon Valley. He has 50 years of experience on the roller coaster of leading tech innovation in startups, public and private companies, all in high growth, high margin mode that marks the norm in Silicon Valley. In the last few years before retirement, Clay was tapped for his experience and talent building teams and mentoring, playing an advisory role at several additional early stage companies. You can see why. Check this out. In the late 60s, he was literally a rocket scientist at Lockheed. In the 70s, Clay worked in marketing and product management at two semiconductor companies, bringing this transformative technology to market. During the 80s, he started and sold three companies. In the 90s, he was EVP at Adaptec and CEO at Radioland, whose backers included Cisco, Intel, and venture capitals companies. Then he spent 15 years at the hybrid cloud computing infrastructure company Load Dynamics, who also acquired Vertana, before joining the board. But having the inside scoop as I do, I know this journey started at the ripe age of 15 when my grandfather asked my dad to take over his dental practice. So, Dad, can you take it from there and share how you made your way from a Chicago suburb to the beginnings of Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it's been a long ride for sure. Yeah, my dad was a dentist and a successful one. And when I was 15 years old and I think probably a junior in high school, he was asking me if, my long-term career plans were to take over his practice because he would have it all ready for me. And I thought about that and I said, I don't think that's the career path for me. I want to be an astronaut. Which is a sort of typical response, I think, from a 15-year-old looking at being a fireman or a policeman or something. For me, it was I wanted to go into space. And he says, okay, I think you might want to check out all the requirements for what it takes to be an astronaut and what you would have to do to get there. And so I did. And I went through a fairly significant analysis at that point. This was in the late 50s. And we already had an astronaut program in the United States that had comprised of 10 people at that point in time. And almost all of them were part of one of the military branches. They'd all been to school one way or another, many of them to West Point or the Air Force Academy or something. But two and only two of them had identical backgrounds, and that was they went to Purdue University, they studied aeronautical engineering, and then they went into the Air Force and became test pilots. From there, they got into the astronaut program. So I said,
Pretty good research for a 15-year-old, I'm just going to say.
Well, that led to actually making applications to get into Purdue and getting into the Aero program and joining Air Force ROTC when I got there and all those kinds of things. And yeah, I was on my way to really wanting to do that until I failed the eye exam in my sophomore year. And that was the end of becoming a pilot of any kind. So I wound up, graduating from Purdue with a degree in aeronautics and astronautics, and then went to California to join Lockheed, whose core second stage rocket really was the core of almost every launch vehicle that was trying to put something into orbit around the Earth at that time.
I call this the hidden figures part of your bio.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, at Lockheed, playing rocket scientist, I got into a series of issues that involved both missiles that were used for military purposes as well as space vehicles that were launching things that were in the race to the moon. But that was in the Gemini and early Apollo stages. So we had to solve some problems that were fairly mechanical, but the solution to those problems involved solving equations that were way too complex for the current stage of math. We had to invent some math, and we actually got a Stanford math professor, to come help us invent mathematics to how to solve the problem. So yeah, that was an interesting project to work on. We finally got it right, and the rockets stopped failing when they were halfway up, and the space race continued.
So what am I right in remembering that you were one of several students from different top universities that Lockheed wanted to recruit?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lockheed understood at that point in time that the math that was required to figure this is a vibration problem and involved large structures that had all kinds of strange cross members and things, and the rockets were basically shaking themselves apart on the way up through the atmosphere. So they knew that slide rules were not going to be the way to solve the problem. They were going to have to use, all this new technology that involves computer systems. So they looked around at MIT and Case Technologies in Ohio, Purdue, Stanford, and Caltech. And they hired one of us from each of those schools that had computer science classes. There was no such thing as a degree in those days for computer science, but we had at least taken some computer classes and knew how to spell Fortran. So we could, when we got to Lockheed, they actually gave us a couple of months to decide what kind of computer systems we would need in order to solve the problem. And after talking about it for hours on end, we decided that we needed what was at that point in time a UNIVAC machine, was the biggest, most powerful scientific computer. But after putting the first one in and trying some of the math we were trying to solve, it turns out we needed two of them. Lockheed bought them both. They were very expensive machines in those days, and mainframe category machines. So we figured out how to do the math, how to basically do iterative things on those mathematical equations, and then come up with some solutions, which turned out to be very simple.
After it was really hard.
Well, once you figure out what's going on and what the feedback loop is and all that sort of stuff, then actually making a solution for it isn't that hard.
And so Lockheed, and this is something maybe people don't know about Silicon Valley, but Lockheed chose that geography because they wanted to be near Stanford. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, turns out that the beginning of high tech in what's now Silicon Valley was really born out of World War II in a combination of Stanford University with a lot of very smart folks, Lockheed, which at that point in time was a defense electronics company and was mostly involved in electronic radar systems, things like that, another company called Varian. It was that core that built some of the aircraft technology and radar systems that helped us win World War II. That was the core of high tech at that time. So when Lockheed and when we got into we shall reach the moon and return safely before the end of the decade, that's where
because the Sputnik thing launched that space race.
Oh yeah. Well, that was before I even went to college. That was when I was still in high school. They launched the rocket and put a very small baseball-sized satellite up in space, but it was proof that you actually could take a rocket and put something in orbit and it would stay there, at least for some period of time. And that spooked everybody because we didn't know what they put up there. Turns out, I think it was just something that went beep, 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 and let people know where it was. But
they weren't sharing. They weren't sharing what they put up.
They were not sharing, no. And I mean, no matter what it was a proof point that said technology to do this was being developed rapidly, and we had to be, as a defense of our own country, involved in that technology and get ahead. And we were clearly at that stage behind. So yeah, it was a massive effort to catch up and become the experts.
So from there, so you spent, how many years did you spend at Lockheed?
I was at Lockheed for 3 years, I think. By the time I left, we had a man, um, up in orbit, and we put somebody eventually, right at the end of my career there, on the moon. So
And back, and back. That
and
was
back and back. Yes,
right.
that
Wasn't
part,
that kind of the hard part, like getting
that
back?
was the harder part, actually. It was getting them back. We had figured out, during the 1960s how to get lots of stuff up into space. Getting it back again safely was a much bigger trick. And the lunar landing module and all those things that were involved with their own rocket systems and their own fuel systems and all the reliability issues that you needed to make sure that when you pushed just one button and you had only one shot at it, it had to work, and it had to work perfectly. So yeah, there was a lot of very complicated things in those days. Seems like all second nature now,
but not at that time. And so that got you to California, to the Bay
yeah.
Area. And so what was next?
Well, after solving the problems that we had solved and gotten the man on the moon, I got a phone call from a fraternity brothers, turns out, who said, have you thought about leaving the high-tech world of rocket ships and getting into some of the new, very brand new technology called semiconductors? And he was at Fairchild, and convinced me not only to come look at the world of semiconductors, but to also get into the world of marketing, where instead of doing pure engineering work or physics work or math work, we got involved in products and profit and loss side of the business as well. So yeah, I wound up working at Fairchild, was there for almost 4 months, 5 months, something like that.
It was a wild ride, though, in
Yeah.
those 4 months, right?
Yeah, it was. I got to meet, a lot of the folks who were at Fairchild in those days. But I got an invitation to go on one of every Friday afternoon sort of beer busts at the Wagon Wheel, which was across the street from where I was working, and sitting there talking to a couple of guys, and one of them says to me, you ever thought about going to work for a startup? And I said, what's a startup? And they said, well, we have some ideas about taking this technology in sort of a new direction and making some real new products and exciting things. And we have some venture capital, and so we're going to start in a few weeks. We're going to leave here and start a company right next door to where you're working. And I said, so what is it you're going to do, and what's a VC? And after some conversation, I said, look, I just left this huge company of 30,000 engineers doing engineering work, and now I'm all of a sudden in marketing, and I'm trying to figure out what a semiconductor is and how it works, and what do you have to, I need a little time at least to adjust to what. And he said, well, okay, we'll see you down the road sometime. Well, the company that started next door had its own tank farm and all the kinds of things that you need to build a semiconductor. As manufacturing was being done right there on site, both in our building and theirs. We shared a parking lot, and they didn't put a sign on the door about who they were or what they were doing for actually almost 2 years. And eventually, they put the logo on the door, and it was one of those little eyes that represented Intel, and and that was the company I didn't join in its very early stages.
Right, there were 4 of them who started it. So when I tell your story, I always say my dad could have been the 5th Beatle at Intel.
That's right.
But you still got to be part of that whole history, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, as we go along. I just think it's great context for everyone to understand the breadth of experience that you have had. So our topic here is AI and bringing your perspective to what's going on today, and so much of the discussion around AI is appropriately, I think, focused on the research, the data, the training that goes into AI models, and then, eventually develops, what we hope are a lot of new products and certainly new innovation. And so, given the experience that you had in, Silicon Valley, knowing how important, research is to innovative breakthroughs, can you share how research was prioritized in those early days at Silicon Valley and the changes you've seen to how research gets funded today?
Yeah, I mean, when I started, early in the business of semiconductors more than in the Lockheed context, but there were laboratories for at least a couple I'm very familiar with, the big companies. One was RCA. They had a lab in Princeton called the Princeton Labs. There was another one at Philips, the worldwide NV Philips, which was in Nijmegen, Holland. Both of these were huge facilities that had big budgets, and they were being done by private companies. More recently, you've seen government labs do these kinds of things. DARPA, for example, was a government-funded equivalent of what these guys were doing. They were funded to do core research. It wasn't about developing a product. In fact, it really wasn't about development per se. It was about checking out science to see whether or not you can push the boundaries of technology that existed, or in some cases, starting from scratch and starting a new technology that was somebody's brainchild, and it looked like there might be, some very interesting future things that might come out of it, but there was no proof points for. It wasn't required to have a proof point for that. It was let's fund science. I mean, certainly there are equivalents in the health industry and other sorts of things like that, but in the world of high tech, those big labs had some of the most brilliant scientists around the world, and teams of people that were working on a lot of things that we've never heard of, that didn't really ever make it into any significant market recognizable product, but some did. And it's obviously you put money behind a dozen projects, and if one or two of them really pan out into something useful, then you've spent your money wisely. Well,
It's better to, I think, do that research and let it fail there than actually fund a company and have only 1 in 10 companies make it, which is kind of in the VC model. I mean, it seems like kind of smart money up front, but I mean, how do you see it today?
well, back then there was a series of stages. There was a thing, pure science and pure research, and it was monitored, and I got a chance to do that on several occasions, to have people who were more responsible for product management and profit to go into those laboratories and sit down with some of these really brilliant folks and talk about what they saw as possibilities, and try to combine that with a business perspective that would say, okay, if we did the following kinds of things, could this kind of a product work? What are the product kinds of requirements then? Is the technology capable of delivering that? How long would it take? How much would it cost? All those kinds of questions. But the interaction between the product-oriented company who is responsible for devices or systems or whatever, and products and making money, totally different in those days. Well, it's collapsed. I mean, there used to be an entire venture capital industry that was founded on the notion that you had to develop things that were brand new to make the technology move products further, faster down the technology path. And without the core research, you didn't really even know what was possible. Incremental improvements, sure, we could do that from pure engineering perspective, but without core technology to push it along, that wouldn't happen. But the venture side of investment was focused on trying to, provide core technology and then make that bridge. into real product development, which is the company responsibility.
And so
Um,
today you're saying it's collapsed, which I think is right. And they're trying to basically get that out of a engineering department within a product focused company that has,
that's correct.
quarterly, financials that they got to deliver. I mean, so that's
And
it
even
from what
even
you've
in
seen.
VC industry, the investment industry itself, the VCs have grown so big with so many limited partners. These are not anymore, small, wealthy investors that are making these kinds of decisions. It's now huge funds that are worth billions of dollars and have hundreds, if not thousands, of limited partners. And guess what? That's driven just like any company stock would be driven. I want a return, at least on a yearly basis, if not a quarterly basis. And so the VC industry's changed considerably. So the funding from the private sector is not as readily available to do pure research as it used to be.
What do you think that means for AI given, I mean, AI has obviously been around for a long time, but the demand for it now, and certainly generative AI and agentic AI, these are brand new things that have people very nervous about what happens when machines take over. So, what do you see as the kind of implication or the tough thing for how AI gets developed, given the fact that research isn't quote pure research anymore?
It somewhat depends on your perspective of what you mean by a product even. Um, in some ways, the AI is a product in the sense that people are actually paying money for the AI technology as it's being developed. But AI is really a platform. So in the sense of developing products that are going to, find their way into the general marketplace, um, you're at a stage where you almost look at AI today as a research project.
Mhm.
Yeah, it gets its funding from selling, basically shares in the technology as you go along to the public. But where AI is really going to, I think, hit the road in terms of commercialization is when you develop specific applications to work on that platform. Now they're happening today, and they've been happening for a while, and it's going to accelerate, and there's going to be a lot more of them as we go forward. But the AI roadmap, if you will, is still pretty up in the air. There are so many possibilities and so many different ways you can think about what to do with it. Some good, some bad, and you have to find your way through all of that. It is not a new problem. It is the same issue that we have faced, throughout my career. But it's happening, and we're going to get there. And I think an awful lot of the angst around where AI is because we haven't really seen where this technology is going to show up as real applications that serve a real purpose in the world.
And that
Uh,
probably makes it hard for the people investing hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in the platforms as their investors have an expectation that it's already a product. And there's probably some friction and disconnect there today.
well, absolutely there is. I mean, every CEO of every big tech company who is investing billions in AI research are being asked the question: when is this going to turn into a P&L impact
Hmm.
and show me profits every quarter? And the answer is, yeah, it takes time to work through building core research, building platforms on that core research, providing the tools necessary to develop applications on that pure research, and so on, and into the marketplace.
Well, in my experience in data science and predictive analytics, it takes time to train models and AI models. I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, ChatGPT took 14 years before it got to market.
Yeah.
Now, all AI models do not take 14 years to train, but they were obviously building new. But, everything that, I hear from the expert, it takes 3 to 5 years to really train a model before you can trust it. And look at how much they still have errors. So, I mean, there's just that on the modeling front, let alone kind of the platform technical capabilities and product front. So I think there's a lot that goes into AI that probably people expect it to deliver kind of that product ROI before it's ready. But to your point, we'll get there, and it's moving faster than anything else. So let's talk a little bit about how to build product roadmaps and how to spot which technical capabilities will have staying power. So how did you and your colleagues do that in the early days of semiconductors? And how did you kind of separate hype from real promise?
Uh, um, well, tell one specific story, but it happened over and over again. Um, I took, I had the opportunity working for, I guess it was Signetics Phillips at that point in time. And there was this big research lab in Nijmegen that I got permission to go spend a couple of months at and sit with the scientists and their research projects and all of the people who, and I was viewed, I think, as, oh, this guy's here to check on us to see whether or not we're going to get our funding again next month or whatever. But I think I managed to convince them that what I was really looking for was what are their ideas for how we're going to take this technology forward? Where are the kinds of products where continued funding for research, in fact, will lead to a company making some money from a product? And they had all kinds of ideas. Many of them were just, kind of wild, cool kinds of things that we could do, but they didn't really have a marketplace to serve. Then there were
those are called solutions looking for a problem.
Right. There's that category. Then there's a category that says, yes, this technology will eventually get to a point where XYZ can happen, but it's a long ways away and it's going to cost a ton of money. Is there an ROI involved along that place somewhere, even if it's further down the road? But can we see where there's going to be a huge market that can be served by this new technology? And then there's the ones that are, within a year or two, we could have a real product in a market. That market's big enough we can go actually make some forecasts about how and where, what kind of product, and what are the specifications for those products that the customer needs, et cetera, et cetera. And it was like being a kid in a candy store. You couldn't possibly consume all of the things that were there. And everybody was kind of actually, by the time I left, competing for, here's an idea and here's something, and I'd really like you to take this one back and do something with it. We finally settled on a few, and I think the next step we took in most of those was to go take a specific idea to a customer base. So we established a seminar program, and I had a very understanding VP of sales and marketing at that time, who was capable of saying, yeah, it is worth making an investment here that's got a long term to some sort of monetization, if you will. Didn't have that word in those days. But we went out we picked, a dozen, 24 of our best customers, the ones that we had the closest relationships with, and convinced them that building a roadmap was something that both companies wanted to do. But there's always the technology is moving quickly. The engineers who are developing products at the customer level, computer systems, for example, didn't understand 100% about where technology was going to develop chips before you ever got to launch a product that they were currently designing. So we had to share information about longer term roadmaps and where the real requirements were for building a new higher performance computer system or disk system or whatever it might be. And there was some resistance to sharing that kind of information. There were R&D projects on both sides, and that was proprietary information that we don't know. So yeah, okay, we had to sign NDAs and all kinds of stuff. But when we finally got people in the room, and there were like, 3 or 4 of us that would come out from the semiconductor company, go to these computer companies. In those days, it was IBM and the Seven Sisters. It was Digital Equipment and Prime Computer and, companies that no longer exist. But those are the kinds of companies that we were talking to about where the next generation of computer systems was headed, what the requirements for those computer systems in terms of chip technology that would go into them. And then we could talk about the technology on the chip side to say, well, this can do this now, or here's a product that will be here in 6 months from now. So don't spend the 6 months designing with this, spend it designing with something else. We got a lot of design wins out of that. That customer feedback and tying technology together, both from a need point of view and a capability point of view and a timing point of view, was critical, I think, to making success out of all of that.
You know what you're bringing up, which I think is a really good conversation for everyone trying to figure out the AI story, the AI roadmap today, is how important the partnership is with sales.
Yeah.
And I know that you worked with some of the greats, and you can maybe, share some of that. But I think today, when we look at the pressure of profitability, sales teams are under enormous pressure to deliver quarterly, right, sales numbers. I've seen it sort of firsthand, and sometimes these numbers, you're like, who came up with these numbers? Like, who's going to make it there? So sales executives are under increasing pressure to deliver short-term deals in terms of it's quarterly or even within the year. What's your take on when you see an amazing sales leader who's able to balance those things and really understands the value of selling the roadmap, especially in something so innovative as AI, which semiconductors certainly was that innovative back in the day? What did it take between product and sales to create that level of partnership and trust to get in front of customers, sell the future roadmap, knowing it's not all known because we're inventing stuff here? How does that partnership work, and what can other people kind of take away from what you've seen and experienced?
Well, to be honest with you, it would never have worked without support from the top. Um,
But the CEO had to enable that support. Yeah.
And the VP of Sales and Marketing that I was referring to earlier was Mike Hackworth, and Mike was he was in charge of both sales and marketing, which was kind of key to start with. So he kind of had an idea. Now, marketing was not product management, but kind of the tactical marketing implementations once you were launching a product from that point forward. But that meant that we had to have a fairly close relationship in the product management side of things with that team as well. I happened to work for Mike in kind of a bridge role at that time. And I mean, it took some effort with talking between us and the CEO of the company at that time to say, here's the long-term implication of a conversation like we were just going through, but in a lot more detail. And how much time and effort is it going to take on the part of the sales team, who is supposed to be very short-term, quarterly results oriented, to actually take time out and go do something that's more in a 2-year time frame than it is in a 3-month time frame. And while we came to an agreement that it was extremely important to do, and it was extremely important to put some funding behind that kind of traveling around the world and putting on, I don't know what we did, something like 45 seminars in a year, and do that with big customers who had to have a degree of trust in what we were doing, which meant the sales team had to go sell this whole idea to their customer. And then of course there's the risk side of that is, well, what if you don't deliver what you promised in 2 years time, et cetera, et cetera. And besides quarterly results, the sales team's one big problem is building relationships with customers. And so they were very, very protective and not wanting to risk, damaging a relationship like that. Well, even after we had core headquarters agreement on what we were doing, we sold that whole concept of coming to a customer, to the salesman responsible for that customer, before he would take the action items to go organize, spend the time and take the risk. And the benefit to him as a salesperson over a period of a couple of years would be way more beneficial if they could actually participate in it. That didn't mean you weren't really responsible for sales at any given month along the way. You just had to do it as an extra project
Yeah.
along the way. And I'll tell you, there were some real long knockdown, drag out kinds of, I don't want to do this, you have to do this, and eventually the headquarters, management teams would have to get behind it and say, you're going to do this. But, and then to be honest with you, on the customer side, same issues. We're letting these guys into our core engineering team, their salespeople. Do we really want to share with them what our future plans are? Because they talk to all of our competitors as well, which is all true.
Yeah.
But that's eventually you get into, someone somewhere in the company who's high enough to be able to make the decision saying there's benefit here and it matters. And it all comes down to people and relationships we can form with people and some degree of trust to make that go. But those partnerships are what really makes new things happen in some significant way.
And what accountability needed to be in place for the product teams to deliver, even if it wasn't exactly the timeline, because it's never the timeline that you put out. But what was the accountability that internally that the product teams had to sign on for so that the sales and marketing teams could feel confident doing this?
Well, actually, that was maybe kind of the easier part because the objectives for any given product group, they were assigned P&L responsibility. Mm-hmm. And they were assigned.
I think that's important. That doesn't always happen.
So yeah, they were responsible for forecast by product. They were responsible for, inventory builds and product manufacturing capability and all that sort of stuff. Investment in capital equipment to make some of the technology that they were trying to develop and so on. So having the roadmap would justify the capital expense if you could deliver the roadmap. If you didn't deliver the roadmap, first of all, your P&L fell apart, and then all of your funding fell apart. So the risk reward on the side of the product side was pretty high. Yeah. And you had to do it. There was no other way to make decisions about where to move forward except somebody's gut feel and throwing a dart. And while a lot of companies did just that, as the companies got bigger, they couldn't afford to do that. They had to have some justifications for where they were going. It was still, a fairly risky business. It was still the Wild West. A lot of things happened, based on individuals, their belief systems, and willing to take the risk.
So there's a big mindset and culture piece of it. How did you deal? And I think we're gonna come back to that. So I'm gonna stick that for just a second and come back to that. But how did you see it being navigated when you deliver this future roadmap and your customers are now sharing, but they want something custom for them? So like your roadmap's really nice, but I really want this, and the salespeople bring it back to product like that's not the roadmap, that takes us off track, right? This is a normal part of what happens. How did you see that being navigated?
Well, that was a constant conversation, whether it was part of this roadmap question or not. Yeah. Everybody needed something just a little different or a little special or something proprietary.
Yeah.
And there were financial decisions along the way that says this is worth doing or it's not worth doing. Many times, we would bet on something that we had developed for one computer company that by the time we got there was acquired by another computer company, and that new company already had some other way of doing it. So, yep. Yeah, it was. There were never 100% guarantees around anything. If you could reach 30% success rates, you were typically doing pretty better than.
So you talked about the need to have the CEO really on board for any of this to work. You really need that commitment, that air cover, that way of rallying everyone together. so we know that innovation doesn't just come from cool new technologies. There has to be a business case that gets that bleeding edge research to market. And I know you spend a lot of time in your career on this. So can you share what works and what doesn't in terms of building a business case that the CEO and the board will sign off on?
Well, there's a lot of different kinds of things that you have to figure out. I think the more customer feedback that you have when you present a case we used to, I guess, once a year, there was always one big meeting that said, this is what our budget's going to look like for the next year. And that's from the CEO to the finance department to marketing to sales and all the way down. Manufacturing, everything. It says, this is what we're capable of. This is how much it's going to cost. This is what we need to move everything forward in terms of people and equipment and capacity and so on. And there was always a demand for, 2 or 3 times as much as anybody could afford. So we had a couple of places where we implemented systems that had analytical steps along the way. What are the holes that currently exist that need to be filled? What are the opportunities that we need to look at that need to, really significantly be addressed? Can we prioritize between being successful at some particular customer base versus another? And then market sizing and length of time in addition to cost. Those are fairly analytical, straightforward kinds of things. There was then also sort of the emotional, non-analytical side of the equation. For example, we had I'll go back to the early days of semiconductors when, a couple of junctions on a piece of silicon that made a switch was a big deal. Now we've got a few billions or hundreds of millions or something on each chip. But we used to have, we had an opportunity to get into medical devices at one point in time. And medical devices is a different kind of market. It's relatively small and mostly instrumentation that's used in just a few laboratories or manufacturing systems somewhere around the world. Well, there was one that was a much bigger volume, which was the notion of a wearable medical device. In particular, in those days, it was a heart pacing. And we had a device requirement from the leading people building heart pacers, which are all external. You would wear them on a belt or something, and you'd have wires that were going inside your skin somewhere and finding a way to, send an electronic pulse every time you wanted your heart to beat. I mean, that's what a pacemaker is supposed to do. The resistance to building a device that was somewhat custom for that company came from a risk side of what if that device failed, who was responsible for a human life.
So the product liability.
And who had the insurance to cover any such potential event. I mean, pacemakers are not 100% effective.
Yeah.
Occasionally, they don't work. If the device is faulty, that doesn't matter. All of a sudden, you're in a lawsuit. And we actually delayed entry into that marketplace, even though we had the only solution that was capable of meeting current specs for 2 years, because the legal and frankly the head office was more risk averse in that regard than they were in implementing the technology. To be honest with you, that financial risk on one side and human life and what you could do to enhance, expand, whatever, the human side of that were being weighed specifically one against the other. Technology is not always a nice, clean, straightforward path. There are any number of things that are involved that might prevent its use. There's I mean, the fear of, AI and where that technology is going to lead is one of those in most cases. It sort of depends on people's mindset about what could happen that's either bad or what can happen that could be really good. And you come to that decision from a predetermined mindset. I mean, that you're coming from here or you're coming from there, and there's a twin showing. Eventually they do, that's not true. But technology moves forward one way or the other, whether it's a competitive force or just a pure demand, force of nature kind of thing that moves things forward. But you can't always control everything,
Yeah.
but you do the best you can.
I mean, it just brings up the huge conversation happening in AI today, which is disruption to many facets of the industries being affected, which is most industries. I don't really know. I'm sure there's some that aren't, but I think for the most part, most industries, right, are being affected either from tech that becomes obsolete, and that's happening really fast, to people being displaced in their current roles, and lots of things in between, like you've just been talking about, the risk of a product, the potential promise of a product, like all of these risk factors, kind of come into play. But I think a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen to me and what's going to happen to my company and what's going to happen to maybe the whole category of the kind of job that I have to, today. Disruption is the name of the game, right? And, what's your perspective on how people can think and prepare for the changes that really are already in full swing with AI and really are moving so much faster than a lot of other technologies have in the past?
Yeah, I'll go back to one of the earlier. I mean, I feel like I'm talking about things that happened 50 years ago, and I am, because it's more about, I guess, how I develop my own mindset about these kinds of questions and other things that happened year after year after year during my career that were based on how I formed those opinions in the first place. And in answer to this one, again, early days of semiconductor industry, there were there was a requirement to build a piece of silicon that had some electronic characteristics on it. In those days, very simple things, a diode or a couple of transistors or something. And once you put it on silicon, you slice it up into all kinds of tiny little pieces that were, this big, which that's huge by today's standards, but nevertheless. And then you had to put it down on some other kind of substrate, and then you had to bond little wires to it that came up the leads that were in a bigger package that you could then solder onto a PC board, and so on. There were assembly lines where hundreds on each line of semi-skilled workers, many of them immigrants, willing to work for relatively low wages, but required training, and then did a very repetitive job of looking through very powerful microscopes, vernacular microscopes, just looking at it, and taking one transistor at a time and putting it down inside of a package that had a place to solder it on, and then taking and bonding a little tiny gold wire that was about as thick as your hair, one hair, and bonding it from the chip itself to a post that was inside the package so that you could get that signal in and out and off the chip. Those people would spend hours, well, 8-hour shifts, 3 shifts a day, hundreds of them, making these little tiny wire bonds, looking through binocular microscopes the whole time.
Wow.
That was a lot of people who got premium wages in terms of just manual labor, that were eventually replaced by essentially a robotic implementation of that. We called it automation in those days. We didn't call it robotics, but it's the same thing. And all of those people over a period of, I would say, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, were replaced by automated machines doing that same job. Yes, there were thousands of people here in the United States and eventually overseas that were displaced. But if we hadn't done that, we'd have never been able to develop the complexity and the size of the chips that we have today. So, yeah, that one, when I saw that happen the first time, and I got to know an awful lot of the people who were on these lines, they worked for me. They lost their jobs, and it was a tough thing.
So what perspective and guidance can you offer to today's skilled workforce in terms of mapping out their own careers now and becoming the leaders of tomorrow?
I would specifically say that there are going to be very high paying jobs for the people who do AI and software development using AI. But that's the engineering side of things. The place to put your mind into where are the companies that are building the application that makes some sense. I know, for example, I can get medical diagnoses and things from a relatively generic description of a problem or a medication or a procedure or something like that says, okay, we diagnosed you with this, and then they give you, 10 words of totally unintelligible, chemical or physical descriptions of your ailment or treatment. Put those words into an AI engine that will explain every single word of that diagnosis. Anybody can understand that kind of thing because it relates to their personal life. Find the places that have real world applications and go to work there.
What about for today's leaders and what AI is demanding of them?
You really need to understand both the technology capabilities and what your customers are demanding of you. What product is it you're trying to deliver in what time scale? And can you deliver to that need better than anybody else? It's almost never going to be perfect. You got to go focus on something. Mm-hmm. Building the generic platform like AI is one thing. And yes, it can be lucrative, but that's not the majority of the kinds of companies that are successful. It's more about taking those core platforms and implementing it in a way that addresses this market segment over here and be done differently for this market segment over there. And building, again, the roadmap that says, I need to focus on something I can deliver because I've got a requirement for short-term profits and reports and all that sort of stuff. But I've got to get the next one after that and the next one after that. Single product companies are generally not all that successful. You got to find a way of introducing new products with new technology to new markets on an ongoing basis. You're not going to get them all right. So the other mindset that you got to latch onto is take the leap of faith. And if it's not going to work, if you're going to fail quick and fail early, right? And get on to the next one.
Pivot.
If you don't take some risk, there will be no rewards. But managing the risk in terms of being informed before you start and monitoring as you go so that you know that you should keep going or give it up and try something else.
I've always framed it, what is the cost of staying in status quo? You've often said it, what happens if we don't move forward?
That's a hypothetical. What happens if? The notion of standing still in the world of high tech or moving very slowly is almost antithetical. As antithetical as it is to the high tech world, the more normal it is everywhere else.
Well, this has just been a really informative conversation. And so, Dad, just thank you for joining the Lead the Machine podcast and for all of those of you listening. This is meant to be a dialogue, so your comments and feedback. Thanks everyone for their time in watching. Dad, thanks again for sharing your insights, super valuable. And we'll see you all next time. Bye.
Good. Thanks a whole lot. Good luck.
Thanks.